Since I inadvertently pushed the wrong button on my screen, instead of pause, I stopped and ended the last video. Strictly speaking, this is now an elderly Jewish professor part Deux-A. No, B, that's right. Okay, good. So I have to say, most of my students know that I don't normally dress this nicely, and that, generally speaking, the only way to describe my wardrobe would be the Yiddish word shmatas, which is the Yiddish word for rags. I think that it's nice to look nice. How's that? As if my mother was watching this, and she would be disturbed if she saw how I normally dressed in class. But I also went to shave and everything, and halfway through the process, I realized tonight that nothing seemed to be happening. I shaved with an electric razor for halachic, for Jewish reasons of Jewish law. That's a complicated thing. And after a few minutes, I thought, geez, not only is this a smooth shave, but my beard is heavier. And then I realized a couple of minutes into the process, I forgot to take the cover off the electric razor. So the reason it was so smooth and ineffective was the same explanation. That is the same kind of technological mastery that ended the last video and started an elderly Jewish professor, part Deux-B. So back to our subject, background. After the horrible events that overcame our nation in the last month, starting with the killing of Mr. Floyd and then the subsequent events, many colleges and universities reacted and wanted to show their conscious desire to bring their institutional attention to these issues. And in addition, at my university college, Converse College in Spartanburg, and in many other institutions, the college administrators imposed mandatory diversity and bias training. So if you saw my first video or read my letter, I announced publicly and explained publicly why I refused to do that. So what led to the letters that I'm going to read tonight? A day or so afterwards, the president of my college issued a public letter addressed to those students who had either read my letter or had heard about it, and suggested support and help in the light of those students, I think, who felt offended or perhaps even wounded by it. On the same day, so I sent my letter on the 15th. This, I think, was the 16th. An angry student whose identity I don't know, she wasn't in my classes, sent the president a letter of support, which she also addressed to me critically. And in that letter, she accused me of being a racist. Now, I have to say, if you're on a university or college campus right now, there are certain terms that are thrown around more frequently and heard more frequently on campus than hello and goodbye is heard in the outside world. And those phrases, for instance, are racist, sexist, fascist. Are you wearing protection? Racist, sexist, facts. So the problem is I think those words are so overused and underexplained that they almost become simple generic terms of contempt rather than genuine ways of responding to an argument. I think, as you'll see in my letter, I think that those charges are more an attempt to silence than to address. And to some degree, I think they have become substitutes for genuine argument and thinking, and again, help to reduce argument to name calling. So, as you're going to see, the student who was offended, I think that would be the fair statement by my letter, accused me of being a racist. Well, I raised the question of what she means by that in the letter. So let me just say that I'm going to suggest what that term might actually mean. Remember, if we overuse designations like racist, sexist, fascist, whatever, then in a way they cease to lose meaning. And the point at which political conversations becomes meaningless, or the words we use are simple slogans, we are very quickly approaching an Orwellian world where the governing authorities can use the emptiness of language to help oppress us. And indeed, we will have opened the door for that kind of governmental oppression because we ourselves gave up genuine thinking. Whatever else, if you read Orwell, not only his two great political novels, 1984 and Animal Farm, but his whole career was devoted to keeping the language pure, or at least accurate when it came to political and social phenomena, so that foolishness and tyranny shouldn't sweep over the human race. It seems almost absurd to say that keeping language and thought clear would prevent tyranny. But it seems to me what I know about history and politics, and from my study of political philosophy and history, is Orwell had it exactly right. So as a preface to my reading the students' criticism of me and my response, let me make an attempt to define racism if I can. What is a racist and what is racism? I think there are real phenomena that term describes. In my mind, there are three components to racism, any one of which or all of which constitutes a racist idea, a racist expression, or a racist individual, and racism. First, a racist believes that race is the core fact of human life, that race is the essential aspect of human identity that designates and establishes and underpins our humanness. Second, a racist believes that one of the racial distinctions, one of the racial groups of humanity is superior to the others, and the others are inferior to it. That superiority, by the way, doesn't extend, or it might involve specific characteristics, but when we talk about equal or superior or inferior, we're talking about essential humanity. In other words, this second component of racism is an aberration or a departure from the Declaration statement. In the second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'll stop there. That notion of equality, and by the way, modern thought, modern politics, and the first practical nation based on those, the United States, in its declaration, most of modern politics and modern philosophy is a debate about the relationship between those two sub-concepts, equality and liberty, equality and rights, I should say. So when the Declaration says that human beings are unequal, what is it saying? That human beings, that there's no rank superiority that would have founded ancient regimes such as royalty or aristocracy. Because the word aristocracy comes from the Greek word aristos, which means best, and the kratein part, which means the rule of the best. And to some degree, the notion of equality in the Declaration and in modern thought is essentially a political equality, but it's a social equality, and even in some ways an economic equality, although we know that modern societies get in debate about economic equality. And at any rate, you could say, stepping away from the larger question, what the Declaration means to say is that one human being is equal in the kinds of rights that define our humanness. And in that sense, a racist steps outside that framework and believes that no, that one race has more humanity than another race. So, and by the way, in the South, before the Confederacy and in the Confederacy, that inequality was best expressed by Calhoun, for instance, John C. Calhoun, or George Fitzhugh, who wrote an interesting book which I used in my class, Race and Racism in American Politics, A Sociology for the South, in which he argued there was, in fact, there was a different amount of humanity in the Caucasian race and in the African race, which justified the slavery, and therefore slavery was mutually beneficial for both races. So, again, the first element of racism is that race is the defining key in human life, that humanity is assigned according to the racial category. Second, that one race has more humanity than another. And third, that political power and social privilege and cultural position should be assigned according to race, and that somehow the racial markers of a human being should be the indicator of how much political power that person is entitled to, or how much cultural power. So I think it's important to keep those three things in mind. Let me say, if you react to this presentation, then and you still think in some ways that my letter was racist, either my first letter, which some respondents suggested that, or this letter, then please, before you vent by throwing up your anger on the screen, first tell me if you agree or disagree with my definition of racism, and then explain how my letter, or my first letter or this letter that I'll read tonight, falls into that category. At least we might diminish the amount of anger between us and might replace it with more thoughtfulness. And one of the reasons I don't think I'm a racist is, like most professors, I believe that the critical element of human life that determines humanity is whether you're tenured or not. And so I've said it. All right. So let me make one other reference before I read the student's critical letter and my response. In my letter, I recommend 3 readings because I think they address the factual truth claims of my students' criticism of me. And let me give the citations for those if you wish to pursue them. I recommend them. The one is an article by Jason Riley in the Wall Street Journal on June 9th, 2020, entitled "The Full Truth About Race and Policing." The second article is by Heather McDonald, published in the Wall Street Journal on June 2nd, 2020, entitled "The Myth of Systemic Police Racism." That one article, by the way, that she posted in the Wall Street Journal is a condensation of her larger book on this issue, The War on Cops. The third article is published on June 8th of the Wall Street Journal in 2020 by Nestrida Yumga, and that article is entitled "Violence Threatens Black Lives." So I recommend, because one of the issues, if you remember, if you saw my first video, is I protested the college administration assigning professors diversity videos, yet how could I possibly, as a professor, then turn around and assign my students reading? And to some degree, my answer is I tell my students what to read, I don't tell them what to think. Our administration, and I think these videos, goes beyond, it's not like a training video in how to park correctly in college parking lots, or keep buildings clean, or even react to COVID or something. I believe that these videos contain a recommended way of thinking about human beings. Now, that way of thinking may be right or wrong. My whole point, one of my points, I should say, in my first letter is it somehow disturbs the essential nature of the collegiality of a college faculty to impose not only readings but also ways of thinking. So, with that in mind, I shall read my student's letter. It's not my student. I didn't have her in class. And by the way, to preserve her anonymity and her identity, I scrubbed all references. I referred to her as Miss Smith. So, this letter was addressed to me, to President Newkirk, and to me, and to, in some ways, the college community. Here it is. Dear President Newkirk, first of all, I want to say hello. I hope you are having a wonderful day. Secondly, I want to thank you for taking the time to make changes on Converse's campus in addressing racial injustices and working on things to enact these changes. It's a step in the right direction. Third, I wanted to bring your attention to this email that was sent to some of the student body and professors by Dr. Polvordi. Whether he intended or not, this email was damaging, racist, and not okay. In it, he addresses a few things that struck me as incredibly harming. One, the focus on rioting and looting other than the Black lives that have been taken because of police brutality. He mentions George Floyd and the terrible circumstances surrounding the death, but not without discrediting his death by focusing more on other circumstances. This is dishonorable and not okay. He brings up a police officer who died as well. Any death is horrible. The problem is when it's only brought up to deny the black community justice. Then it becomes wrong on so many levels. Not to mention that it is not the same. Police choose the job they do. They know the risk involved, and if it gets to be too much, they are ultimately allowed the decision to quit. Black people do not have the same choice. They are targeted because of their skin, and often their deaths do not get justice. If a black person is killed by a cop, often the cop is acquitted, and no justice is served. If a black person kills a cop, the cops tend to, if not always, instantly receive justice. In addition, he mentions anti-Semitism directed towards him. That is awful, and I won't say differently. Once again, if you bring it up only when another community is hurting, this is wrong. At any point, he could have spoken up and worked on changing those things for himself and other Jewish members of the converse community. He didn't. He even says this in his email that he chose to stay silent. If he had spoken up at any other time, I too would be fighting for more inclusivity of our Jewish community and to make sure religious freedoms are met for all members of the converse community. Making sure Converse is a community that respects all religions at all times is important, and a conversation that at some point the college needs to have. Yet, he chose to bring this conversation up now, specifically when the conversation is on Black lives. This deflects from the issues at hand and centers the narrative around oneself, and it is not okay. Finally, for the last 4 years, I have had required readings on almost every syllabus. These syllabi also address rules we must follow in class. Never once did I see this as coercive, even though not reading them could have caused me to make failing grades on assignments, fail classes, and or ultimately not obtain a college degree. In fact, some of my friends took Polvordy's class. They had readings assigned by him, yet not once did they say that was coercive. In fact, one of my friends mentioned that one of the readings he assigned was a letter from the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, which I'm sure could have made many, if not all, of the people in the class feel incredibly uncomfortable. And by the way, if you saw my original open letter or watched the video, I did, in fact, include the letter that I had received from the Ku Klux Klan in 1987, and I included it in the email and read it on this platform. And there's no question, I've used it in class too, so that is a correct observation. I hope assigning readings is not coercive. If it is, every single professor on any campus, including Dr. Polvordy, has been guilty of coercion. I hope that you were able to take this time to read the email. I have sent Dr. Polvordy this email as well so that he can see the other side of things since I read his side. I thought it only fair since I was responding to and addressing his side. Regards, Converse student. Now, in my response, what was my intention? It was, in fact, to meet some of Ms. Smith's arguments, but also I hope to demonstrate what a disagreement informed by the genuine dynamics of liberal arts education would look like. I tried to craft a response to Ms. Smith's letter that would demonstrate what people who respected each other but disagreed on important things would look like. I tried to be courteous, I thought. I tried to respect her arguments and address them respectfully. I have to say that the response was quite surprising. I won't say that all hell broke loose on campus, but I think it is fair to say that since this letter went out, that a substantial number of my colleagues and certainly a substantial number of students now believe that I'm a racist thug. Did I think that did I anticipate that reaction? No. Now, one response, which I'm sure that some of you are thinking is, so blind are you in your racism, so blinded by your white privilege, so blinded by your adherence to your own point of view, that you failed to see how harmful your words were, and that you would, in fact, unleash as much pain as a Swedish masseur on steroids. I assure you that was not my intention, nor did I think my words would produce that. Whether or not I met the standards of respect, courtesy, and seriously addressing Miss Smith's arguments, well, I'll leave that to you to decide. Here is my response. Dear Converse student, Miss Smith, with no disingenuity, thank you for your energetic and sincere letter in response to my letter and expressing support for President Newkirk. I appreciated, as I am sure that she did, your support for her. Being a college, soon to be a university president, is a difficult and complex task, and I do not envy her job, and I do not, by the way, many aspects of which I am not competent to perform and would not want to try. Nevertheless, when our leaders err, it is sometimes, not always, our responsibility to stand up to them and to explain to them their error. For it is possible to criticize someone and admire and even love them, him or her, at the same time. Although I am not a Christian, I believe that many Christian leaders, including the founder of that faith and the founder of our college, would agree with this statement. Indeed, such a spiritual disposition can be found in almost all of humanity's great religions and philosophic traditions, including Judaism. I wrote and published my letter to the college only because so much is at stake for this precious community and for me personally within it. You expressed serious concerns and criticisms of my letter, which deserve a serious and dignified and firm response, which I shall attempt to provide here. In the video that accompanies this letter, I address some of your criticisms, and I shall respond to the others here. You do not, and by the way, I do summarize them here because in some ways I did succeed, I think, in the video of my reading of my original letter to explain some things that in fact led to Miss X's criticisms. More about that in a minute. You do not reveal your racial or ethnic identity, and frankly, that's not important to me. You do, however, identify yourself as a present or former Converse student, and that is very important to me, as you shall see. In one criticism, you characterized my letter as damaging, racist, not okay, harming, and dishonorable. Additionally, you suggested that I had failed to demonstrate a lack of concern for Converse and its Jewish and black students, and perhaps a lack of courage by failing to denounce publicly the discrimination regarding my religion and political views that I have experienced here, and that they, my Jewish and black students, because as I mentioned in that letter, I was the informal Jewish advisor of Jewish students because I was, most of my 34 years at Converse, I was the only Jewish person on the faculty, or the only traditional Jewish. And I have to say, at all the 6 other institutions that I've taught at, Converse, Dixon College in Pennsylvania, Carleton College in Minnesota, Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, William and Mary College, I often functioned as an informal Jewish advisor. Well, for many years at Converse, I was also the faculty advisor for the African American students. So I talk about that in my letter and how I tried to use the dynamics of liberal arts to help them address the lack of liberality among their fellow students. So, to go back, if I may read that line again. Additionally, you suggested that I had failed to demonstrate a lack of concern for Converse and its Jewish and black students, and perhaps a lack of courage, by failing to denounce publicly the discrimination regarding my religion and political views that I experienced here and that they reported to me. You also made an additional criticism regarding my complaint about the administration's mandate to undergo sensitivity training by claiming that I had been caught in a contradiction. complaining about assigned, quote-unquote, material at the same time that I and every professor assigns readings to our students. I addressed this particularly in my video and will not repeat my response here, but begin. Since I realized this was so critical to the student's letter, I summarized that argument, and here it is from that video. In the video, in my response to this argument, I argue that a professor assigning his or her students an assigned reading is not the same thing as a college administrator mandating or ordering his or her colleagues to watch a video. The essential equality between a professor and a student is essential to a liberal arts education. A professor assigning a reading respects the mind and integrity of the student. A college president, although the administrative superior of the faculty, is an equal colleague among colleagues when it comes to the intellectual life of the liberal arts community. For a college or university president to command his or her colleagues to watch a video on quote-unquote diversity, bias, racism, and inclusion, unquote, essentially disrespects his or her colleagues and is in effect commanding them not only what to watch, but also what to think, given the content of this kind of material and its moral rather than its intellectual content. I always tell my students what to read. I never tell them what to think. In this last criticism, you included a subsidiary criticism that I perhaps had overstepped the bounds of appropriateness by laying in front of my students material that disturbed them and made some of them feel uncomfortable. And by the way, this is a common issue now in university and college life. Should, for instance, English departments assign Huck Finn when it's clear that the N-word, for instance, is found throughout it, because, of course, the novel is set in pre-antebellum Missouri. As you'll see, in fact, that's the first argument I deal with. Let's deal with the last first. I do indeed require my students to read and watch disturbing materials, which I sure renders many of them uncomfortable. But I do not require this of them in order to assault their dignity or equanimity, or to take pleasure in the power that I may possess, to cause emotional distress to those under my authority, which is a frequent disease of those in power. Let me pause. If you've ever had a bad boss or a teacher who abuses you in the classroom, then you know one of the defects of power. Lord Acton says one of the most famous phrases in English is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the framers knew this too, by the way, and which is why they thought the Constitution that they were designing was addressed to and anchored in the weaknesses and strengths of the human being. Madison says in Federalist 51, "But what is government but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels." And when I teach American government, I could pretend to be my uncle, my senile uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, who would always say, "Have I already told you this story?" And of course he's told you 20 times. I can't read this to my students enough. The Constitution clearly has defects, as does the nation that unfolded from it. But the framers attempted to grasp those elements of human nature that lead to chaos and tyranny, and to create a constitutional republic that would restrain those tendencies. The Constitution does not turn Americans into angels. In fact, that's the great difference between Madison and Marx. Philosophers, intellectual historians, we have a tendency to think, well, Marx was smart, not just because he was Jewish, but Marx was smart because he has this whole intellectual framework and the ideology, and he has scientific socialism that history and class struggle has proven, blah, 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 blah. And Madison was just this short, very short, by the way, one of the shortest of the framers, almost as if Bilbo Baggins was involved in creating the Constitution. But that somehow this semi-articulate politician like Hamilton, these, and by the way, my opinion of the framers, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Washington, it's really the intellectual lights of the American Revolution and constitutional founding are Madison and Hamilton. They form the great substance of the intellectual effort that went into the formation of the Constitution, and why it has in fact endured for almost 250 years. And what's interesting, by the way, when you teach constitutional law or American institutions is how easily and quickly these two giants of constitutional thought and framing came to disagreement very rapidly. Yet they learned from each other even when they disagreed with each other. So my point here is, Madison says in Federalist 51, we're designing this Constitution to address the problems of human nature, not to overcome them or eradicate them, but to contain them. And that is, I think, why our Constitution has in fact led to the world's most powerful, stable, free, prosperous, and just society in the history of the human race. Perfect? No. Moving towards perfection? Yes. Okay. Now, remember, we're in the middle of the argument that that I assign things that disturb students. And again, and my point was, and this is how I got off on Madison, excuse me if you went out to the bathroom or went to the refrigerator to get a beer or a Diet Coke, abusing one of the defects of exercising power over others. This could be parenthood, it could be bosshood, it could be a professorship, it could be a pastor, is power gives you the ability to inflict pain on other people. As Machiavelli built his whole political system on that, and as Stalin knew full well. As my point is, I don't give material to my students to cause them distress. To continue, the letter from the KKK, to which I refer in my letter, and which I've used in class before as an example, but I can name far more grueling and harrowing readings in films. Mein Kampf, A Sociology for the South, which I mentioned earlier. Schindler's List, Elie Wiesel's Night, The Rape of Nanking by Helen Chung, who was so disturbed by her reporting of this horrific event in human history that she committed suicide after she finished it. Saving Private Ryan, Amistad, Birth of a Nation, and so on. That is because I believe a liberal education should enable our students to live life with knowledge and courage, which includes equipping them with, to quote my letter, intellectual depth and spiritual fortitude to understand, and by understanding confront the evils of this world. The subjects that I teach are critical for a human being to live a human life more fully. I try and I hope that I succeed in teaching my students to help them to be more capable of appreciating the joys, the nobility, the greatness, and the gifts of life, while also giving them the wisdom and strength to withstand its sorrows and resist and perhaps overcome its evils. If more professors and colleges and leaders of our academic institutions cared less about, and I invent a word here, therapeuticizing our students rather than about educating them, the founders' ideals of clarity, wisdom, and justice might actually be better realized in the education we provide to them. I would say to you, Miss Student, I didn't say this in the letter, but I say this to you watching this video and hearing it. Professors are there to teach, not to cure. At least if you cure by education, as Socrates hoped, ignorance and bias and prejudice, but also intolerance. So we are your professors, not your therapists. Did I fail to live up to my best? And by the way, this is the one argument she makes, which I as you'll see, well, let me read it and then let you decide. Did I fail to live up to my best by not always denouncing racism and anti-Semitism when I experienced it or heard my students complain of it? Here you may have a valid criticism of me, even at my age of 68, after long experience of being a professor, a religious leader, and a member of many congregations as an American, and a friend and family member. I am not certain of the answer to this question. I must say that I have learned that many situations in life are complex, and sometimes served better by patience and prudence rather than protest and confrontation. I shall grant you, I haven't figured this one out, and am willing to have you and others help me to struggle through towards enlightenment regarding it. Now, As to the main thrust of your criticisms, that my letter was damaging, racist, not okay, harming, and dishonorable. Let's take racist first. I must admit, I knew this reaction would be swift in coming, and it came first in your letter, as I explained in my comments previously. You do not tell me what you think racist, quote-unquote, means, or how you detect that quality in my letter. One distressing aspect of our current political and academic discourse is, to me, how quickly we all resort to hurling epithets rather than seriously listening to each other. I'll confess my least favorite examples of this are racist, fascist, and insensitive, or sexist, or whatever. Such terms are not intended to refute an opponent, but rather to silence him or her. They are the verbal equivalent of a brick tossed or a baseball bat swung. Were my arguments racist, quote-unquote, because I'm white and Jewish? I assure you, the same arguments that I uttered are made frequently by prominent black politicians, journalists, and intellectuals, such as Senator Tim Scott, Jason Riley, Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Walter Williams, and others whom the media and academic world typically ignore, and whose works, I can assure you, are not likely to be included in the recommended readings urged or mandated by the leadership of Converse College. Those arguments may be false, or faulty, or untrue, adjectives that I know you did not employ in characterizing my arguments, but I am still not sure why or how they were racist. I believe that what you were trying to communicate to me and to President Newkirk with the rest of your criticisms can be summed up this way. Let me just say, I've often said that what a Socratic education does, and what the Socratic method does, is to get inside the mind of the people you're disagreeing with while not denying their humanity. And this is what I tried to do in this paragraph, summarize what I thought the gist of her criticism of me was. And here that is. You thought that my letter, quote unquote, and this is my paraphrase of the intent of her criticisms, that my letter, quote unquote, changed the subject from George Floyd's killing and the subject of, quote unquote, systemic racism to the subject of the violence, rioting, and looting that ensued in our country after his death. In doing so, I believe, you meant to claim that I dishonored Mr. Floyd's memory and harmed the African American community and its prospects for a just existence in America and at Converse College, too. With all due respect, Miss Smith, it was not I who, quote-unquote, changed the subject, unquote, from Mr. Floyd's death and racism that may have contributed to it, but rather the rioters, the looters, the vandals, and the murderers themselves who changed and continue to change the subject. Who has harmed the African American community more in America, and who has truly dishonored Mr. Floyd's memory? People like me, or even the police and the governing institutions of our country, who do often fail to live up to our nation's founding ideals, or the activists and anarchists and rioters and looters who, even as Mr. Floyd's brother was tearfully pleading with them to stop, lest his brother's memory be marred and dishonored, they continued in their orgiastic attacks on black communities and our country's great cities. You claim that I have contributed to the denial of justice to black people in America by, in effect, trying to cover up or deflect from the truth that and here I quote a section from Miss Smith's letter. And I add emphasis because to words that I believe are critical qualifiers in the nature of her argument. And I italicize them. And I'll signal like this when I italicize a word that I quote. I think that her letter aims or says that my argument tries to cover up or direct attention away from, to deflect attention from the truth that, quote, and this is where her letter begins, black people are targeted because of their skin, and often their deaths do not get justice. If a black person is killed by a cop, often the cop is acquitted, and no justice is served. If a black person kills a cop, and the cops tend to, if not always, instantly receive justice. And I put in my letter that that's my emphasis, and that is the end of the quote. If I may press you a bit, Ms. Smith, how, quote-unquote, often, since, by the way, the word often is the critical descriptor in her phrase, how often does this in fact occur? Do you know? Have you done the hard but critical work of investigating the facts beneath your claims? I challenge you to read the attached editorials from the Wall Street Journal and then get back to me. I look forward to your further conversation with you. And by the way, those 3 articles are the ones that I referred to earlier in my comments. So, strictly speaking, I say the same term. I assigned a reading, but I didn't really tell Miss Smith that she had to do this. It was a recommended reading. I look forward to further conversation with you after you have completed my assigned, the use of that word playfully, or rather recommended reading. The issues raised in your letter and in my letter are serious, complex, and often charged with emotion. Whether that emotion typically hastens or frustrates clarity and justice, I'm not certain. I am, however, certain that truth and facticity are not identical to passion, and that it behooves every American, every student, every professor, and every college president and provost to attempt the substitute reason, argument, truth, facticity for the latter, anger or passion. Respectfully, Jeffrey J. Pulvorty, Associate Professor of Politics, Department of History and Politics, Congress College. So that was the letter that has stirred many members of my colleagues and faculty, the administration, and many students at Congress College. I would claim that I disagreed with Miss Smith, but I did not assault her. I did not disrespect her. Rather, I took her seriously by challenging her to take me seriously. Don't dismiss me with name-calling. Undermine my argument, not with anger and passion, but rather, if you're going to undermine my argument and persuade me, do it with reason and truth and facts. There. So, if you agree or disagree, whether or not I met the goal of respectful disagreement, that's your call. So, that was the aftermath of my first letter, and we await the interesting unfolding of the future to come. Thank you.